What's up, guys? You're watching Life by TCG. Do not adjust your set. My long-time subscribers, all 30 of you, will know that I mostly do MTG videos. Even though it's Life by TCG, not Life by MTG, it's been pretty much almost exclusively Magic. Apart from the one time I played in that Shadowverse tournament, but that video got like 10 views or something. But this weekend we've got a new TCG, not Magic, not Shadowverse. It's the Final Fantasy trading card game. So for the MTG people who might be interested in this game, I might just quickly explain roughly how it works. And then those of you who are more familiar with the Final Fantasy game already and just want to skip to the like my deck list and stuff for the tournament this weekend, I'll put a timestamp in the description so you can just go ahead and skip to that. So so the way that the Final Fantasy card game works is like relatively similar to Magic. So you have basically creatures which are called forwards in this game. They have like a power stat and a mana cost, but rather than having lands, which is how Magic works obviously, instead every card can be discarded at any time to add 2 mana of its own color. So and then you're not always only like discarding creatures to play creatures basically, because you have the other card types, these ones which are called backups, which are sort of like analogous to lands, but they're more like mana rocks in the MTG sense, because you have to spend mana to play them down, rather than like lands in Magic where you can just play them for free. So yeah, and the other interesting thing is that unlike most trading card games, you draw 2 cards per turn rather than just 1. Obviously, because so much of the resources you're discarding for the mana, so you need a faster supply of cards to be able to keep playing things. And then so there's the creatures, and there's also summons, which are basically like instants in Magic, and monsters, which are basically enchantments, but they're not so widely played or so interesting. Yeah, they're just basically like enchantments. So yeah, compared to Magic, I think the card pool for the game is obviously not quite as deep because it's way newer, and there just aren't so many sets. But the mechanic of spending, like discarding cards to play cards, is really super interesting, because you imagine that you have like a 5 mana card. You could just discard 3 cards to play that on turn 1, right? And in some matchups that might be correct, or depending on what the rest of your hand is, that could be correct. Or, you know, maybe you're not supposed to do that and you're supposed to just discard a card, get 2 mana, and then play a backup, and then do that for a few turns, and then then play your 5 mana card a bit later off mostly backups, so you're not discarding so much. It's because of that whole factor. Like some matchups you might want to be fast, some matchups you might want to be slow. It might depend on what your opponent's doing, it might depend on what the rest of your hand is, and you have to make all these decisions every turn. Compared to Magic, where often you just like look at your hand, or turn 1, what am I going to do? I'm going to play a land. What spell do I have? I have 1 spell that costs 1 mana, I'm going to play it. Yeah, so in Final Fantasy I feel like you just have so many more opportunities to make decisions, and then that often feels like it leads to like the better player winning. And that one person I talked to was also like an ex-MTG player at the tournament yesterday. He seemed to agree with that sentiment. So that the way that damage works in this game is that even though the creatures have power, like this one's 3,000, this one's 7,000, that only matters when the creatures fight each other, because unlike like Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh, you don't have your own life total. It works more like Pokemon, where once you get hit by a creature, no matter what its power, you mill one into what's called your damage zone. And once you have 7 cards in your damage zone, then you lose. And then the cards that have the EX printed in the top right corner, when they get flipped in, when you take damage and they get flipped into your damage zone, then they have like a beneficial effect for you. So it's like a comeback mechanic. And maybe that's something to dislike about the game, because often those effects are a bit swingy. Like even if it's just something as simple as draw a card, that can really like make you pull ahead quite far in the game. But yeah, that's only really like a minor drawback. Overall, I think the game is really well designed, pretty well balanced. Sometimes it feels a little bit like matchup swingy, like certain cards are like really effective in certain matchups, and that's not helped by the fact that there's no sideboards and all the games are best of one. You do get a mulligan, you get 1 free mulligan, which is good. But yeah, they're the main drawbacks, I would say. But from like a strategic gameplay interesting perspective, I think it's really, really solid. So now the tournament that was played, so this is the part we're going to skip to for all the people who are more familiar with Final Fantasy already, was called a Crystal Cup, which is kind of like a Nationals / GP kind of event. I think it's mostly like a GP for Magic. So there were 80 people, and really I've only played this game for about a week. So I played about 10 games on Untapped.in, which is like a online tabletop simulator like Cockatrice or Magic Workstation. Then I played a few games on Thursday night against my friends to like homebrew decks. He said they weren't really like meta decks. Then I played in one like FNM 3-round tournament on Friday, and then after that straight into the GP. And the GP was also like a dual format event, so it was constructed and draft, and I obviously hadn't played any draft either, so that was a bit of a wild ride as well. So the deck that I brought for the constructed portion was Mono Ice with the category 6 theme. So of course it's Final Fantasy. All the cards in the game are based around characters from the video games, and there are often synergies built around like characters from the same game. So this deck is built around characters from Final Fantasy VI. So I'll just run through it really quick. So 3 Ghost. Maybe this isn't played in 3 copies so much, but I think this card is really strong. 1 mana attacker is really solid for a tempo deck, and it effectively often costs no mana with the recursion ability, and it puts a permanent on the field to help you trigger your lock discard on the interplay. So sorry for the Final Fantasy fans, I'm going to like interchangeably use Magic language a lot. So when I say like untap or tap rather than activate and dull, and I'm going to talk about like mana cost rather than CP, which I don't even think I know what that stands for. Crystal points maybe. But yeah, so it should be all straightforward enough. I hope you can manage that. So 3 Ghost, 2 Laswell, just like a solid cheap attacker and relatively strong removal. But this card is pretty, I wouldn't say underpowered, but it's not too exciting, and there might be better options out there, either in future sets or if you want to tweak the list a bit. Another similar card that people often play is Sid Reigns, but in my testing I really didn't like that because it just felt a bit too situational. Like I just wanted to more reliably be able to kill things with the higher amount of damage that Laswell does. With Sid Reigns, often I felt that like your opponent wouldn't have anything killable with it because it only does 4k damage rather than Laswell often can easily do 7. And also often your opponent, when you have so much discard, is already empty-handed anyway, so you didn't even get the extra value off the discard. 2 of the 3 mana sellers. So I think these ice decks typically only play 1, but I like having 3 mana category 6 forwards, especially with the ghost, because it gives you the play of turn 1 backup, turn 2 3 mana forward, discarding the ghost, discard another card, bring the ghost back, which puts 2 bodies on the field on turn 2 for a pretty low investment. So yeah, I don't mind having extra copies of this, more than the 1 that is usually seen. You could even go up to 3 and I wouldn't think it's that bad because you can discard the excess copies to the special ability on the 4 mana sellers. But I mean, yeah, having six names over 1 character in your deck is probably too many, so I don't think I'd really go in that direction, but it's something to think about. Then 3 lock. This is like one of the most expensive cards in the game, or at least in my deck anyway. I don't think it really gets too much more pricey than this. It's just, for like the Magic people, it's basically like a Hypnotic Spectre, and if you have 2 other Final Fantasy VI characters in play when you cast it, it also makes them discard a card on into the battlefield. So it's pretty strong. Definitely automatic 3 copies in ice. Then 4 Genesis, also another ice staple. 4 copies, pretty essential. It also is like a spectre that makes them discard when it deals damage, and also when it enters the battlefield, in Magic terminology it's like Frost Links, so you tap one of the guys and it doesn't untap for a turn, so it's a pretty good tempo swing. Then 4 Sellers. This card feels like slightly underpowered for a 4 cost, but freezing things on hit is pretty strong, and the extra damage, the 4k, you can often combine it with the Laswell or the 3 mana Glacier Labolis, the summon, which I'll show you when we get to it, to kill things up to like 11k, which is pretty strong. And then the freeze on hit is also fine, but it definitely feels a lot weaker than say Genesis for the 4 mana cost. But again, it's also another Final Fantasy VI forward, so it has synergy with that as well. Then 1 Kuja. I think this card is a staple for ice. Just being able to sacrifice your backups to return it to your hand, and then either cast it to lock a guy down, because this also has the Frostlinks effect when you play it, or just keep returning it and discarding it for like a mana burst in the late game when you're making like a final push. Really solid, definitely essential. 2 of the 5 mana forward Setzer. I wasn't playing the backup Setzer, I was playing some different backups to get the category 6, which you'll see when we get to it. So I think the forward Setzer is okay, but again, it's kind of pricey. I do like the fact that in the early game you can use the Gestalian Empire Sid to search for this, and then play this and use it to search up another backup while having a pretty solid presence on the board as well. So yeah, 2 is okay. The backup sets is obviously strong as well, so you have to sort of make a bit of awkward decisions around which one you want to use. So what this does is, it just when it enters the battlefield, you can search for any character from Final Fantasy VI from your deck and add it to your hand. Then we have the Blue Eyes White Dragon, 3 copies of this. So you don't actually. I didn't actually cast this too often because I think really the deck is more of like a kind of aggro, low resource kind of deck, um, where you don't really want to like play to the late game too much if you can help it. But again, like I said at the start, like depending on what your opponent is doing, sometimes the game kind of plays out that way anyway. Like for example, if you have a bunch of like if your hand's like Genesis and stuff, you don't really want to play it onto an empty board because you waste um, the tempo of the tap down effect. But then again, sometimes, yeah. So in those kind of games, you kind of like go late playing out all the backups. And in those situations, this dragon can be good. So what this does is, if there's any of the Magic players are still watching and haven't closed yet, when it attacks, you reveal the top card, and if it's ice, then you add it to your hand, and it will always hit in this deck because everything is ice. And then it has 2 active abilities. You can discard 1 ice card to freeze a forward, which means it doesn't untap, or you can discard 3 ice cards to break a forward, which means destroy it. Yeah, so but the other thing that I kind of thought about this card is that in some situations it might be fine to just play it on like turn 2. Like you play it back up on turn 1, then on turn 2 you just tap the backup, discard 2 other cards and play this. Because that early in the game, for some decks, it can be relatively hard to deal with. You don't want to do it against like water, for example, on an empty board because they can just Famfrit it and then you're down quite a lot of value. But some decks don't really have any good way to stop it, like this deck doesn't, for example. And even if your opponent has to like turn to Diabolos, discard 2 cards, then you basically just traded evenly anyway on resources, because at that stage of the game, like untapping obviously untapping their forwards does nothing, untapping their backups does nothing. Well, it gives them like 1 more mana that turn, and you don't have anything else in play, so they can't like juke you with the one of your forwards becomes 1,000 power effect. So I think there are like quite a few situations where you're just meant to go super aggro and like slam this, but because I'm so new to the game, like I didn't feel like I was very good at identifying those spots, and I just wanted to sort of play like a lower risk game than that, so I didn't end up doing that too often. But if you know the metagame a bit better, I think that's probably a line that's correct in some situations. And then the last 2 forwards, like the creatures, are 2 orphan. So this is like just a big late game punch through card. So what it does is when it enters the battlefield, you tap 2 of your opponent's creatures and they don't untap. And then whenever this attacks, you target creature doesn't untap. Of course, only for 1 turn. But yeah, just being able to play this down and effectively like sleep 2 guys, really strong way to end the game. You wouldn't be even too bad to play a 3rd one, but I'm just not too sure what to cut for it. And again, it's pretty expensive, so you don't want it to clunk too much. In the summons, so like these are instants. So we have 3 Mind Flayer. This is just a pretty solid card. Like when you have the lock and the Genesis, being able to punch through in the early game is pretty good. Like if they play it and block it down, trying to stop themselves from discarding. And then in the late game, you can use it to set up big kill turns. Like you Mind Flayer one of their guys end of turn, and then you untap, and then you play like an Orphan, for example, and then you dull the other 2 guys and swing for lethal. And of course it's a cantrip, and it has the EX draw card as well. So I was really not upset by this card at any point. I think it's really solid and no complaints about playing 3. Glacier Lebolus. So for the Magic fans, I like to think of this card as a kind of Coligan's command. It costs 3 mana. The effects are target player discards a card, so that's like Coligan's command. Target creature doesn't untap next turn. Tap target creature and deal 7,000 damage to target tapped creature. So just like with Coligan's command, often the mode that you choose is the discard a card plus something else. And yeah, just like the variety of effects this gives you means that it's never dead. So it's a really solid pick, I think. I think most ice decks I've seen all play 3 of this card, which I'm not surprised by because it's really solid. And then the last summon, I have 3 Zalira, the Death Seraph. So this is like a known card. I wouldn't say it's that popular. And I'm playing another. Yeah, so what this does is it destroys every tapped creature your opponent controls, whose cost is a prime number. So 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. Because you have so many ways to tap your opponent's creatures, it's very easy to not worry about that part of the text. Like, you can just consider it as destroy all tapped or untapped creatures that have costs that are prime numbers, because it's just so easy to keep your opponent's creatures tapped. But there are often situations where somehow your opponent's creatures will all cost 4 and then this card just doesn't do anything. So it's possible that it should be another card that's just a bit more broad in application. But there were also a lot of times during the tournament where I felt that, you know, like me top decking this card was like my route to winning the game, just because it's such a swinging effect and it often destroys like 2 or 3 creatures. And I do have another card in my backups that combos with it pretty strongly. So yeah, definitely a meta consideration, because obviously if your opponents are playing lots of 4-drops, then it's not very good, or 6, I guess. But yeah, overall I was pretty impressed with it in testing. But yeah, like I say, I'm so new to the game, I really can't tell at the moment whether that's actually that good or not. And then onto the backups. 2 Snow. This card is really strong. I think if this card didn't exist, then maybe the deck wouldn't even work. So what this does is whenever one of your creatures, so when this is in play, whenever one of your creatures attacks, you get to tap target creature. It's a very powerful effect, especially when you have so many cheap forwards like Ghost and stuff. And then once the creature is tapped, you can keep it frozen with like the Glacier or the Orphan or the Sellers, both of the Sellers, the 4 and the 3. So yeah, definitely very integral to how the deck works. It keeps your opponent's creatures dull, so you can destroy them with Zalira. Some ice decks I've seen only play 1 copy of Snow, but I think it's pretty correct to play 2. Just when you have it in play versus when you don't, your deck feels like it's operating on a completely different level. 1 Assail. I think some ice decks are not playing this card, and it's kind of a bit of like a tech pick. I think it was more popular because this was released in the... Oh, it's not too old. It's the 6th set of the game, and now they're up to 9. But I like playing 1 of this card because the most common thing you do, so 4 mana backup, when it enters the battlefield, you search your deck for an ice forward and put it in your hand. So the main reason why I like this is because it lets you find the Kuja more reliably. That's one of the most common plays I find myself doing with it. And that's another thing, kind of like Snow, where having access to it versus not having it makes the games play out in quite a different way. So I do like having the additional reliable access to that. But you can also use it to find, say, the Orphan to make the big late game punch, or the Dragon for like a mid-range kind of thing, or the Setzer to help you set up some more backups later on. So yeah, I think 1 Assail was pretty solid. And because the way the mana works in this game, which was one of the interesting things that I sort of had to pick up quickly compared to Magic, is that even though this costs 4, it puts another card straight into your hand, which you can then instantly discard for 2 mana. So in a way, this card like effectively only costs 2 mana when you think about it in that sense, which is kind of a thing coming from Magic that you have to like wrap your head around. that anything that gives you card advantage in a way is also giving you like mana acceleration, which changes the way that you think about a lot of the different cards that are out there. So that's just something to be aware of. Then 2 Harley and 3 Edward. So this is like a pretty commonly played combo in all ice decks. It's just, so this is a 3 mana backup. When it enters the battlefield, your opponent discards a card. So not only do you have that card advantage aspect if you just tap 3 backups to play it, but also you have to think, you can think of it in like the mana advantage sense that I just explained for Ysael. So if you play this and your opponent discards a card, then effectively this only costs 1 mana because your opponent lost 2 mana worth of cards out of their hand. And also has the effect that you can tap it to discard another copy of itself, and you can counter any summon, like counter any instant. So that's pretty strong as well. And then you have the Harley, whose only effect is, it's a 2 mana backup, so it adds 1 ice mana by itself, but it also makes your Edwards 2 cheaper to cast, so then they only cost 1, which is like insane efficiency, playing 1 mana to get a backup and make your opponent discard a card. One thing I was wondering is that the other Edwards in the game actually seem relatively strong as well. Like there's a 4 mana one where it has the effect 2 mana and tap it, your opponent discards a card. And there's another one which has the effect, like I think it's 2 or 3 mana. You pay like 4 mana and tap it to tap any creature. I think both of those also seem quite strong, but nobody ever played them in any of the lists that I could find. So I didn't want to get like too adventurous with it. Yeah, this configuration of like 2 Harley and 3 Edward was really common, so I just basically just copied it, but it makes sense in a really solid cards. Then we have 2 Gestalian Empire Sid, so it's 3 mana backup. When it enters the battlefield, you search for a category 6 forward and add it to your hand. I think after I played the tournament I might go up to playing 3 of this, just because it helps you to get set up so well. Part of the reason why I only played 2 is because I forgot to buy a 3rd one. When I was ordering the last few cards that I needed, I didn't realize that I only had 2, so I could only play 2, but 2 was okay, but I think you might want a 3rd one just because it helps you get everything set up. Then 1 Amina and 2 Cositus. So these are just basically cheap backups that have the effect of when they enter the battlefield, you like freeze your opponent's creatures. Freeze is like doesn't untap for 1 turn. I might as well show you the 2 Sid Allsteins in this as well, because they basically do a similar thing. I think this mix, you can have a lot of variation. Like Jill Nabat, the starter one, is pretty popular, the one with the special ability. Also the Jill Nabat that blocks damage from backups is relatively popular as well. Emperor from the starter is pretty solid, the one where you can discard 2 cards to destroy a forward. Basically what I thought was that Cositus was probably the most powerful one in terms of its like into the battlefield effect, and I think you can afford to play 2 even though they clash with the name, because again, for all of the MTG people that possibly still watching, every permanent in this game is legendary, unless it has the special effect that says that it's not, which I can't show you because I'm not playing any of them. But yeah, so if you have one of these down, you just can't play the second one. Of course, you can always discard it to make mana, so it can never really be too bad, but sometimes it does clash when you just have copies of cards that you already have in play. You can't do anything. So especially if you have like 2 of these as your only backups in your opening hand, like you might really want to have another backup for turn 2, or play them both on turn 1, but you can't because the names clash. So there is a lot of merit to splitting them. So for example, Cositus might only be marginally better than Emperor, and to avoid that clash, maybe you just want to play only one of each. That was a bit of a consideration as well. But in the end, yeah, Emperors were really hard to find, and I thought that playing only 2 copies was pretty safe. The Amina is like a relatively fringe. Some decks do play it. I really like having a backup that can sacrifice itself, especially in situations when you don't have the Kuja, because often you need to break one of your own backups, for example, to create a slot for the snow, because in this game you're only allowed to control 5 backups, you can't play a 6th one. So just, I mean, the end of the battlefield effect is like pretty fine. Just freezing a guy, breaking a forward is also decent, and just getting itself off the table can be pretty strong. The Sid Allstein is a really strong effect. 3 mana for it is sometimes a lot, but I thought that I had enough cheaper backups that it was going to be alright. And coming off having the EX effect as well is pretty solid too. So in the end, I think the Sid was pretty acceptable, but like this whole mix can be changed to include like Emperor or Juniper or whatever other ones that you like. Then the last 2 backups were like kind of my whole idea behind the deck, which were a bit different, was the 2 Terra. So what this does is it's a 3 mana backup. When you play a summon, which are the instants, right? These 9. You get to tap target creature. So obviously with this Zalira is really good because the tap will resolve before the destroy. So even if your opponent has like 1 untapped creature that you want to kill with this, you can cast it and then Terra will tap it in response. So you successfully destroy their creatures. Mind Flayer becomes like twice as efficient. You get to dull 2 guys for only 2 mana instead of just 1. And then also with the Glacier it becomes more efficient as well. You basically get to choose 3 of the effects rather than just 2. And the Terra is also a character from Final Fantasy VI, so you can search for it with the Setzer and it counts for the lock discard. But sometimes this was good. I think overall, like, I was maybe being a little bit too fancy with that. Like I say, this is sometimes a little bit too situational, the Zalira, and I mean, really, honestly, the deck only has these 9 summons anyway, so you can never really get too much of a benefit out of it. So if I was going to keep playing this deck in the future, which I mean I probably will, I'm not going to buy like a whole new set of 50 cards, what I would probably do is replace this Terra with the backup Setzer, and then maybe cut one. You'd have to probably cut at least one of the forward Setzers because they'd clash, and then maybe play a different summon rather than this Zalira, like either the 1 mana Zalira or the I can't remember what it's called, but it's like 1 mana destroy target creature that's blocking. I think that one's pretty decent as well. Or you could just play like a 3rd Orphan, for example, or something like that. But yeah, I think probably this Terra, it was like a cool idea, but I think unless you're really confident that you're in a meta where this Zalira is going to be insane, I think you probably want to like change this setup somehow. So yeah, that was the deck. So I'll try and talk about my matchups a bit, which is hard because I obviously don't know what half the cards are or what the decks do. So in the first round I played against Lightning deck, where I made a pretty huge blunder. So my opponent had this creature, it's like, it starts at like 6,000 power or something, and it gets plus 1,000 for every other creature your opponent controls. And then when it attacks, if it has 10,000 power or more, destroy target creature with CMC 3 or less. So I had my own lockout, right, the 3 mana guy, and then he had the thing and 3 other guys, so I was at 9k. And then he also had Maya, which is it has the effect at the beginning of combat. Choose one of your creatures. It gets +1000 and first strike, and then there's some other modes as well. Like rather than that effect, like the beginning of combat, you tap something, or I can't remember what the third one is. Anyway, I was so hung up on like the counting the opponent's creatures to determine the power, I forgot that the Maya also gave it an extra 1000. So what I should have done is just mind flared that before it attacked, but I completely forgot it was already at 10,000, so I let him attack with it, and then he got to kill my lock for free. But somehow I ended up winning that game anyway. The next round I played against Ice, Mono Ice, which I'm a big fan of because I don't have to read any of my opponent's cards because I'm basically using them all myself, or I've like looked them up as I've been trying to build the deck. So I don't know either if I got lucky playing against these Ice, or somehow like the cards that are in my deck are maybe like a lot stronger versus Ice. But some of the weird choices I made, but I don't think my deck's that unorthodox. Anyway, so yeah, playing against Ice, I always felt like I had a good chance, and I beat that guy. Then I think round 3 was another Ice, which I beat Mono Ice again. Round 4 I think was Water, where I made another mistake. I forgot that Famfrit has the EX burst, so my only forward was an Orphan, and what I should have done was play another cheaper forward before attacking. Like obviously Ghost would have been fine, but I think I might have had more expensive ones like a Laswell or maybe a 3 mana Sellers or something like that, which I should have played before I attacked with the Orphan. But I just attacked with the Orphan, and then he flipped Famfrit, which is like a Innocent Blood effect, again for the Magic players. So my big 6 mana investment died, and then that let him turn the game around. So that was my first loss, so that was 3-1. Then I played against another Ice player, which I beat, and then an Ice Fire, which I also beat. Then I played against Wind Earth, and I think Wind seems like a really bad matchup for Ice. Wind has a lot of cards that untap themselves, and of course you've probably noticed that a lot of Ice effects revolve around not letting creatures untap. So when your opponent's playing all these cards that untap, like there's the Rem, which is really difficult to deal with. There's some monster that's like when you attack, they sacrifice it, draw a card, and all their guys untap. And then there's also Diabolos, obviously, which lets them untap all their guys as well. So yeah, Ice seems like really unfavored versus Wind, so I guess I was pretty lucky not to play against it anymore. But yeah, that Earth Wind guy was my second loss, and I think he made top 8 as well, so I guess he was a pretty good player. Then after that I played against Mono Ice again, so that was this last round, which I just barely won. Yeah. Oh yeah, I made another big punt against that Earth Wind guy because I forgot about the Rem. Rem has the ability you can tap it to untap a guy, and I forgot that he could use that to cancel my Laswell. So I spent this big turn of like playing Glacier and like Laswell, and in the end he just negated it all with a trick that was on board, and I could have played around the whole time anyway. So yeah, again, games tended to be a little bit more of a disaster when I was having to read every single one of my opponent's cards that they were playing. But if my opponent was using all of the same Ice cards as me, then it felt like a smooth sailing. So yeah, so I ended the construction portion 5-2. So I think going into day 2 of the draft, I was like 11th place. Not too bad. But like I said, I hadn't done any of the draft format, not only of that set, but also of Final Fantasy in general. So what I did when I got home on Saturday night was look through the entire set and I made like 8 pages of notes. I can just quickly try and see if I can find those. Oh, here they are in the bin. Yeah, so here's like my 8 pages of notes for the drafting the set, because I'm not even familiar with like any of the cards. So luckily the set, compared to a Magic set for drafting, is really small. So in this Final Fantasy Opus 9, there's only 124 unique cards. And in MTG, for example, for example the most recent core set, which is M20, there's 152 just commons. So how many cards is this in total? 152 plus 86 is 238 plus 21, 259 plus 259, 264 plus 60, 300, so 324 cards. So in the MTG set, which people also draft, has 200 more cards in it than this Final Fantasy set. So in Magic, in a draft, every draft pod, so just for the set for M20, of course the numbers change slightly with every set, but one draft has 8 players in Magic and Final Fantasy, times 3 packs in Magic, 24 packs. So every draft pod will open 240 commons, which is only 1.6 of every common in the set. Whereas in Final Fantasy, if every player opens 5 packs, and the way that breaks down is that in every draft, there'll be nearly 6 copies of every common will be opened in the draft. So like, drafting certain commons is basically guaranteed. Like if you look at the color of your opponent's deck, you can be basically 100% certain it's going to have these certain commons in it. And of course there's 6 colors in Final Fantasy as well, whereas in MTG there's only 5. So you're also less likely to be fighting over the same colors as your draft partners. So that was a sort of interesting observation. For example, like each draft pod is going to open basically at least 1 copy of every rare in the set in Final Fantasy. So you could, there were a lot of strategies that I almost felt like a little bit more reliable to assemble. And because of that, I felt that like you could speculate on you could really stay open in your colors, I felt, and especially the first few picks. Because again, all the cards are legendary, mostly. So it's really hard to play, like, even if you identify you want to be like green, if you take like 5 copies of a good green common, that might not even be good because they're all legendary and you can't have multiple and play at the same time anyway. Yeah, so I thought that like what you wanted to aim for was to try and stay open for like very late in pack 1, and just focus on taking the like high power rares, and then then you'd likely be able to pick up enough commons to make your deck playable later. And I think what I identified was that like fire seemed strong because all of the commons seemed really good and it had the best backups. Like fire had, where did I write that down? The backups. I think it had like 4 different common backups that at 2 mana. Yeah, and then another one at 4 mana which had like a pretty strong Enter the Battlefield effect. Yeah, so the interesting thing was that like, because there's no basic lands, because when you do a draft in Magic, you can just add as many basic lands as you want. at the end, so you have all the mana you need to cast your spells. But in this game, you have to draft the backups as well. So the way that the backups are like arranged in the different colors is slightly different, and I think that sort of affects like the strength of the different colors quite a bit. The other thing is that the different colors, the rares are quite significantly different. Like in Wind, for example, you have Magus Sisters as one of the rare slots, which is basically unplayable. Like it's just a 4 mana 7k vanilla that doesn't do anything. And also there were other aspects about Wind that made me not like it. Like I felt like it had really weak commons. And the backups also weren't that good. But maybe that was wrong, because a lot of my opponents seem to be playing Wind. But in the end, I'm not too sure about that. Lightning has really good summons. But the uncommons were like slightly medium, I want to say. And the commons aren't too great either. Like the Edea, you really need to be mono lightning for it to be good, which is really unlikely to work in draft. The Seafer basically doesn't do anything. Yeah, but I think I kind of felt like Wind seemed bad, but all the other ones are just kind of like depended on what cards you could get. A lot of the rares are quite strong, so you just sort of want to like follow what kind of bombs you open almost. Yeah, that was my idea going into it. So what ended up happening was my pack one pick one was Squall, which I kind of identified as one of the better rares. It's kind of like a mini version of Orphan from my constructed deck, so it costs 1 less for every guy you control from Final Fantasy VIII, and when it attacks and when it comes into play, you can tap target creature. So I first picked that, which I was pretty happy with, and then Squall's actually even better than I thought it was, because you have Laguna in the set at common, which searches for it, and of course because each draft pod opens so many copies of each common, you're basically guaranteed to get multiple Lagunas, and then you can basically search for this, which is almost like kind of a bomb. I guess not really a bomb, but like at least a good rare. So yeah, this is my pack on pick one. I tried to sort of take a few ice cards, but I didn't really get any ones that were too solid. I think early I also took the Wind rare that I got past, this Adele, which I think is quite strong in the draft. I thought that due to the relative lack of removal that's available in this format, the fact that it becomes unblockable once you have 5 backups seemed like it would be a good way to close games. So I wasn't too happy about drafting Wind, but this seemed like a solid pickup. And then I sort of like was a bit all over the place in pack 1, but that was kind of the plan I was going for already anyway. Then in pack 2, towards the end of pack 1, I noticed that water looked really open. I started drafting a lot of the blue backup, the White Sage, which seemed like a signal that water was probably going to be relatively open. So yeah, I started taking those backups to sort of like prepare for it. And then in the second pack, I got past Cecil, which I think is also one of the strongest cards, a really strong rare in the set. Like the damage redirection effect is probably going to make things like very awkward for the opponent. So I was really happy to pick that one up as well. And from there I basically locked in on Ice Water, Um, yeah, and for my second pack I opened Gestal, which basically goes into any deck, so it's like an easy pick. And then either pick 2 or 3 I got past the Cecil, and so I took that as well. And yeah, basically from there I just locked in on mono water, and it was really apparent that water was open, because I got past 3 Bannons. I don't know if people just really underrate this card, or my read on it is completely wrong, but this card just seems so strong in draft. Outside of fire, there aren't too many ways to effectively deal with it, and even if your opponent does try to deal with it, it's got a chance that it just protects itself anyway. And for me, that happened quite a reasonable amount of the time. So there are 1 or 2 matches where I just got very lucky to like flip on all of the abilities in a row. Like that, I would tap it to draw a card, then they would try and kill it, and I would flip it back up and it would counter it, and I'd just get so much effective card advantage off it that there was basically no way my opponent could come back. And then I've got, to supplement the Lagunas and the Squall, I got a Quistis and a Renoa at some point, which was pretty solid. I definitely underrated the Renoa at first. But that card is actually really strong, especially with the Squall. You could often like do these weird turns where you just like Laguna, like if you already had Renoa, you could like Laguna into Squall and then like Dole freeze multiple things and set up this big kill push on the next turn. That happened quite a few times. And yeah, so the Bannon was that's a rare, and then my other rare was the Hurdy, which is just like a cheap backup basically. And then the rest of the deck, I'll quickly go through it, even though there's not really too much to say. 1 Gao, 1 Airborne Trooper, 2 Moogle 12, 2 Yuke, 5 Mog 6. So maybe my read on this card was totally wrong, but it seemed pretty good to me. Again, there isn't a whole lot of removal in this set, and a lot of it is really concentrated in fire. So if that's the case, this is just like a 3 mana forward that draws 2 cards on into the battlefield, which is an insane rate. So yeah, and also the special ability is pretty strong as well, I think. In the end, it turned out that a lot of my opponents were playing fire, which made it kind of a liability, so I didn't end up actually casting it too often. But I don't think it was necessarily wrong to like pick these. But yeah, let me know what you think about it, if you think that was a mistake or if you think this card is actually strong. Then 2 Gis, this guy was okay, I think. Just kind of like a big forward. The funny thing about the ability is that like you always use it just to be safe, but you never know if it's gonna actually help or not, obviously, because if you dodge a burn spell, it just means your opponent's not going to play the burn spell, so you can never be too sure if you're like saving it or if you're just burning cards from the top of your deck for no reason. 1 Mind Flayer was the only summon, but pretty strong just to have something a bit tricky. Then 1 Marlboro and 2 Hundlegs for the monsters. And then the backups, so apart from the 1 Hurdy, 1 Larsa, 1 King of Concordia, how many White Mage? 4. 2 Class 11 Moogle, so this is the one that you power up your ice forward by 1000. And then 2 Locke and 2 Sid Allstein. Sid Allstein in draft I found was a lot worse than in constructed. It was a lot harder to make your opponent get hellbent when you don't have all of the like Locke and Genesis and stuff. I think if I play this again, maybe I'd just try and put some more 2 mana ice backups in there. But yeah, that's the deck. So the one mistake that I think I made in the draft was that I was so used to thinking that the Final Fantasy VI characters were only the like ice characters from my constructed deck, Like, I knew that Locke is a Final Fantasy VI character, obviously. But what I forgot was that Bannon is a Final Fantasy VI character, and so are the Mogs. And of course, in total, I had 5 Mogs and 3 Bannons, which is 8 Final Fantasy VI cards. And I also drafted this Locke, which at the beginning of your main phase, you look at the top 2 cards of your deck, and you can add a Final Fantasy VI card to your hand. So the reason why I didn't play it is because it clashes with the backup Locke, and I just thought that the ability would never trigger because I didn't have any. Obviously, I don't have any like Terra or Celes or Ghost or whatever, anything like that in my deck. So I just thought it would just be like an 8k vanilla. But actually, I do have 8 Final Fantasy VI cards in my deck. So it probably would have been correct to take it and put it in my deck somewhere. And I also passed another one, so that might have been something to work on. Yeah, so this was actually 41 cards, just because I got like a bit panicky because I was running out of time. And I didn't know what to cut. If I was gonna run it back, I think I'd probably just cut the Airborne Trooper. I think that's probably the weakest card in the deck. Yeah, so the first and second games of the draft, I basically just got carried by one of my Bannons. Like, it just, every time I tapped it, or every time my opponent targeted it, it would just successfully flip. The second game, I had Gis and Bannon, and my opponent had the fire guy where you attack and ping target forward, and then it becomes 8k, because normally it's only a 7. So my opponent attacked into this board and tried to ping the Bannon, and then it flipped it back up. Obviously this isn't a backup, but you know what I mean. And it counters the entire ability, so it was still on 7,000 when it was attacking, and I could block it with Gis and eat it for free. And from there, that was basically like too much advantage, and I could slowly win the game from that point. So I've won 2 rounds of I've won the first 2 rounds of the draft. So now I only need to win 1 more of the next 2 rounds of draft, and I can top 8 the whole tournament. And I think my deck seems pretty good, so I was looking forward to that. But the next game, so my opponent's playing Wind, Fire, and I have a pretty strong board. But my opponent plays Nail, which has the ability you can sacrifice 2 backups to destroy, or not destroy, but deal 8,000 damage to a forward. So my opponent's on 5 damage, so I only needed 1 more to kill them, because they are in limited, you only need 6 damage rather than the 7 in constructed. So my opponent's board is Nail, Wall, Warrior of Light, and then Deuce. So he has 3 forwards. He sacrificed all his backups to destroy as many of my forwards as he can with the Nail. So he has 2 cards in hand now, no backups, and he has the Nail. He has 2 cards in hand, no backups, Nail, Wall, and Deuce, all active. I have Laguna and Bannon. So he has 3 blockers, and I need to deal 1 damage to win the game, and I have 2 creatures out. So I untap, I play Hundlegs, which taps one of his creatures when it comes into play, and then I think I Mind Flayed another one. So my opponent only has the Juice back to block. So and I have the Laguna and the Bannon. So that Hundigs can't attack because I just played it, but I can just attack with the Laguna. He has to block the Laguna with the Juice, and then I can attack with the Bannon and kill him. But when I attack with the Laguna, his last 2 cards in hand were Shemhazi and a Wind card. So it's like a 2 mana instant that one of the modes is you untap all of your creatures. So he untapped his Nail and his Wall. He just ate my Laguna for free. Hundlegs can't block because of its monster text. And then my opponent had the Nail, the Wall, and the Juice still. And then obviously my Bandit couldn't attack because he had the big creatures untapped now. And then I just died on the swing back. So that was really, really frustrating. Really like unlucky way to lose the game. But I still have one more chance to make top 8. Again, my opponent's playing a fire deck. And it was a situation where my board was like Bannon, Mog, and I think one of these guys. And I had just a Laguna in my hand. And I was feeling pretty good about it. Obviously, I have like quite a lot of stuff on the board. Bannon's online, I'm getting card advantage off this. I can Mog to make the situation difficult for my opponent to block. I can start attacking. But then my opponent played Chaos Mobius with his fire mana, which is a mythic rare. So if we check our notes, there's like a 50% chance there's going to be 1 copy in any given draft. So, pretty hard card to have. But it has the effect that it's a 6 mana 9,000 forward. And it has the effect that when you cast it, if you spent fire mana on it, it deals 5k damage to your opponent's whole board. So both of these 2 instantly die. The Mog effect triggers when it dies and makes me discard 2 cards, so I lose the Laguna. And then my opponent later played another fire thing to finish this off because it already had 5k damage marked on it off of the Chaos. And from there, like, I'm just so far behind, there's really nothing I can do. I managed to assemble the whole, like, I made a huge play of, like, I think I drew Quistis, which then found the Renoa, and then I drew another Laguna, which went into the Squall. So I made like a huge play of like spamming down. Where did my score go? Anyway, yeah, I made like a huge play of like dulling and freezing a bunch of my opponent's stuff and making all these forwards. But he was up on so many resources on me due to the Mobius play that he was able to like answer most of it, and I was already like way on the defensive anyway. So there was just no way I could like mount a comeback after he had already just destroyed like half of my stuff. So yeah, that knocked me out of the tournament. He ended up coming 9th because his breakers weren't very good. So he was the only player on X3 who didn't make the top 8. And I was the highest player on X4. So if I won, I would have made the top 8 because my breakers would have put me at about like 4th or 5th. So yeah, that was the end of the tournament. Yeah, and I thought when I got home that I was like pretty annoyed at the last 2 losses and that like I'm busy with other stuff and that I'm probably not going to touch the game for a while. But I just, idly thinking about some tune-ups I could make to my constructed deck, and overall the game is actually really fun. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you're an MTG player thinking of maybe starting a new game, I can highly recommend this one. I think it's really well made. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the more skilled player, the more experienced player to make the right decisions and change things in their favor, which, you know, even though Magic is like a really solid, popular game, and there is aspects of that, of course, but I think maybe Final Fantasy you get that even more. So yeah, if you have a local scene, I definitely recommend you give it a go. And then if you're a more experienced player of Final Fantasy, if you have any thoughts on the ice deck that I played, whether you think the 3 Ghost is a bit off, or you thought the Terra was a bit silly, or whatever thoughts you have about that, yeah, let me know. So while I'm a bit annoyed that I couldn't make top 8 just by the skin of my teeth, the top deck Shimhazi or whatever it's called, I don't think it's too bad of a result, again, for somebody who's only really played the game for about a week. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that. I will do another MTG video really soon as well, maybe uploading just straight after this one, so stay tuned for that. This is Li-Fi TCG signing out.